Hi, it's Marisol, your rebel guide to living a life of freedom abroad, bringing you an episode of Roaming the Now, where entrepreneurs, coaches, and mentors come together to give you a behind the scenes look at the real and raw experience of setting out to a new country and building a life and business abroad. Make sure to like and subscribe to Roaming the Now. Enjoy! Hello, and welcome to this episode of Roaming the Now. I am super duper excited to dive into today's topic, which is what is the best way to overcome culture shock. And the individual we are going to be speaking with today is Ben Stimpson, who's actually joining us from Canada. I'm
Yeah,
not entirely sure where specifically you are, so I'm actually going to turn this over to you and let
of
you
course.
introduce yourself to our audience.
Of course, yeah. So I'm actually about a couple of hours from Toronto. So I'm in Southern Ontario. I'm closest to like Detroit than I am to Niagara Falls. So I'm kind of up on the peninsula going up into Lake Huron there. So I'm a therapist, I'm an author, I'm also an expat. I'm originally from the United Kingdom and I came over when I was a child. So culture shock, what we're going to be talking about today, has been a lived experience for me. Something that I have been working on for the past few years is ancestral work, and ancestral work, particularly as it related to me dealing with my culture shock. So I'm looking forward to speaking with you today.
Yes, I'm so excited that you are tying in this ancestral piece because, well, I know that we've talked before, but I grew up in Washington State, really close to Vancouver, BC, Canada, but all of my ancestry, all of my roots is actually here in Mexico. So being here has been an extremely healing experience for me to embrace my culture and like at the same time go through cultural shock, right? Because
Yeah.
the way things are done here are so different. So I would love to hear from you. What was your experience with culture shock before really understanding this ancestral piece that was playing out for you?
Totally, absolutely. So it actually took me a very long time to even realize that what I was dealing with when I was a kid was culture shock. Give you a little background. So I'm originally from North Wales, which is one of the countries that make up the United Kingdom. And my parents are English. They moved over there. I was born in North Wales. And when I was born, I was diagnosed with a neurological condition called dyspraxia. And what that did was it necessitated me needing to have extensive speech therapy with a speech pathologist. Now, when I was born, I went to the same school as all the other kids I went to like kindergarten with. We all grew up together. It was normal, right? And what the teachers and my friends and the parents of my friends all did was make my speech issue completely normal. It was just a normal process, normal part of my life. The fact that I would go to a different school for speech lessons, 3 times a week or something like that. It was just a normal part of us growing up, right? So I felt like I was just fitting in. I was just a normal Welsh kid, right? And then I moved to Canada. And I think you'll understand this, and I think many of our listeners will understand this. I wasn't British until I moved to Canada, right? I wasn't different until I moved to Canada when suddenly I was like surrounded by everything different. And I was 8.5 years old. I was old enough to remember my home country, old enough to remember my friends, and have still very vivid memories of living over there. And when I came over here, suddenly everything was different, and I was different. I had an accent suddenly when the way I spoke was exactly how all of the people I grew up with spoke, right? The way I thought, the things I was interested in, everything was different. So we originally moved to a small city in Ontario here, Barrie, Ontario, which at that point was about 100,000 people. So it was a sizable place. And then 2 years later, we moved to a little tiny town of about 8,000 people. And it was like ridiculously small. All of the people there were related to each other. It seemed like all of my classmates were cousins of each other, right? Not in a weird inbred way, but you know what I mean. It was a small town community. It was a bit like Schitt's Creek in many ways. I actually grew up about a few hours away from where Schitt's Creek was filmed. So really, that image, if you have that image of that small town, that was our lived experience. And I went from that place of me being just a normal, regular individual with no sense that I was different from anybody else that I was growing up with, to suddenly being made to understand that I was very different from everybody else. And that caused a lot of issues for me. When I look at pictures of myself, I was this happy, smiling, blonde, blue-eyed kid, right? Blue glasses, right? Little British accent, right? And as I got into tween and then teenagehood, my smile disappeared and I was an angry, angry kid. And those differences continue to happen, right? Like when I was about 11, 12, I started to realize I was gay. Then I started to realize I was interested in magic and paganism and Wicca and whatnot. And that all tied into what I was trying to do for myself, which was I was trying to get a sense of normalcy while being in a place that I didn't feel like I belonged. And so what I did to cope was I latched onto anything that reminded me of British culture, anything that was connecting me with back home. Um, I watched British television as much as I could. I watched, like I grew up on Absolutely Fabulous, which is a really famous British TV show, and I remember it from when I was back home. So I really latched onto that and really identified with the characters, which I don't think is really healthy. That a 9-year-old is identifying with Patsy Stone, but that's what happens, right? So, but what I was trying to do was I was trying to cope. I was trying to get a sense of grounding in a place where I didn't feel like I had any roots or connections. Eventually what that developed in me was a very weird sense of control. So I had a very, very negative relationship with control. And this often happens with specifically children who are going through culture shock. Culture shock in adults is a little different, but that sense around control and trying to control the environment, trying to control, getting into control dramas. And in my line of work, we call them control dramas. What that often looked like for me was I became very stubborn with the things that I thought that I could directly control. I also hurt the people that I knew I could hurt in my life, whether that was saying nasty things to my sister, whether that was bullying my younger brother, whether that was just being stubborn. Oftentimes, what I would do is I didn't like school because it wasn't a place that I felt safe for many reasons, mainly because I was being bullied a lot for being different. So what would I do? I would often feign being sick, and I would stay home sick. So out of however many days of the school year, 200 days or something like that, I was sick like 40 days of the year. Right now, the people in my life who should have been seeing that this was an issue and that this was actually me dealing with culture shock um, didn't see that. And so I was blamed for that. I was told I was not intelligent enough, that I was stupid, that I was lazy, all of these things. So eventually, what I eventually came to understand, and this was well into my late 20s, I came to understand that the cycles of that control issue that I was trying to deal with in trying to deal with that culture shock um, had created those patterns in my life of, being stubborn, of fearing that I wasn't doing the right thing, or fearing that I was going to be, looked down upon or told that I was doing something wrong. And so I was constantly trying to control the people around me to do what I thought was needed. A lot of these things, it also didn't help that I grew up in a home where my parents were both running their own business. And so there was a lot of focus on that business and not on us. And that's more of a personal thing to talk about, but it all tied in.
Yeah.
So that was in a nutshell my piece around my experience with culture shock.
Yeah, I wanted to say thank you for your vulnerability and openness to really explaining this because I think that people don't really understand that, right? Like when you, especially as a child, I think it's because when we're a child, like I really think we are in our purest state and form. And we pick up these coping mechanisms, right? But there are specific coping mechanisms for children, and there are specific things, right? Because we don't have the, like, as a child, you don't have the full, like, the toolkit to deal with everything that is
Hmm.
happening. But I think, you being able to connect that with, like, oh, wow, like it showed up in my life in the future as control is
Hmm.
like first of all, like, I'm sending you, congratulations for having that self-awareness. It takes some people
Mm,
years and years and years to figure that out, right?
mhm,
Um, and also, I think what I really want to point out here, and so much of the work that I do with my clients is like, we really
mhm.
just want to feel safe. Like,
This is
that's
the
what
thing.
we want to feel. We
Yes.
want to feel safe inside of ourselves. But
Mhm.
the way that that manifests when we're not really actually clear on our patterns can take us, like, the image that I get, and I'm a very visual, I talk with my hands, can take
Yes.
us on this, like, windy, like, windy road of, like, we're just kinda, like, playing, I don't know, tag in our minds until we
Yes.
finally figure it out. But I think what you just explained is a really great example of how,
Mm,
culture shock as a child, you didn't really get the tools to deal with it, ended
mhm.
up showing up as this need for control as an adult, but it was rooted in this core need of safety. And so I just really wanted to highlight this for listeners because
Absolutely.
it doesn't have to only be, right, like culture shock when you were a
Mhm.
child. It really can just be this need for safety inside of us can cause us to do some really interesting things to go about getting it, right?
It's one of those things I don't know if we can necessarily anticipate it because it will manifest differently in all different people, right? This is where the issue with culture shock becomes really deceptive because while one kid, like my younger brother, for example, seemed to be like a fish in water to this new scenario, myself and my sister didn't. And, we both developed very weird connections with Canada because of that. I think that piece around self-awareness, you said, you congratulated me around self-awareness. And I need listeners to understand that I was not self-aware during that. And that in itself was a coping mechanism. Because if I had this space to become self-aware when I was a teenager about what was happening to me, if I had had the space or the ability to work through this and to understand what was happening for me, or even to have an authority figure frame it that way for me when I was younger, I may have been able to develop then healthy coping mechanisms. But I didn't have those healthy coping mechanisms because I wasn't self-aware around it. And I think that self-awareness piece often comes because we're in it. When we're in something, whatever it is, whatever we're dealing with, and I see this with clients all the time. This is really the need for therapy. It's that sense of um, trying to be reactive to the situation as opposed to responsive. Self-awareness allows us to respond from a balanced place of self. Where I was coming from in my life and many aspects of my teenagehood and 20s, I wasn't coming from a balanced place. I was coming from a reactive place. I was coming from the lenses of wanting to feel safe, like you were saying, and that often developed into being paranoid that people were going to be out to get me. So what happened was I shut myself down. I placed all of the things that were just naturally part of my life, and I put them into a place of shame. I'll give you an example. One of the aspects of culture that people don't realize is the idea of scripts. And you don't realize that you're engaging with cultural scripts until you're outside of your culture where the script is different. If you go to a grocery store in the United States and Canada to some degree, I would say US and Canada have very, very similar relationship with this. You go up to the grocery attendant and you say, "Hey, how are you? Oh, I'm good. How are you? Oh, yeah, I'm good." And that's it, right? That's a script. You're not actually engaging with that individual and they're not engaging with you. It's just a custom that you're engaging with because that's what you do to be polite, right? Now, if you go to another country and that script is instead, or that script is suddenly different, you're suddenly like, it's a neurological pathway issue. When you engage in a script, the script is triggered, and to feel secure and safe and whatever, you're in that then neurological pathway. When the script is different, you're forced to suddenly be in a different neurological pathway. That can be jarring, right? So what was happening for me was I was engaging in the scripts that I grew up with, and I'm sure you've seen the same with you moving to Mexico, right? Um, the script was, we don't really talk about our emotions with people we don't really know. So if somebody asked me how I am, I said, fine, thanks. very typical English British way of responding to that question because we don't talk about our emotions with people we don't really know, right? It's not something that culturally we do. And I remember a Canadian said, "Why do you say that all the time?" And she tried to shame me for saying that. Now I was 14 years old when she said that to me. What happened to me in that moment? Oh, okay. Suddenly, and even now I'm feeling like, ugh, it didn't feel nice. It feel like I was being called out for something that I didn't do wrong. But she was projecting onto me that suddenly I'm not trustworthy, right? And that happened again and again and again. So that clash of cultures, that lack of understanding of those cultural pieces created then that lack of self-awareness because so many of the cultural pieces we're not aware of until we're outside of those cultures. So sorry, I've divid on a bit.
No, it's totally fine. I feel like it's actually really important because everything that you're saying and everything that I'm hearing is a lot of things that I actually, try to explain to people. Like, for
Absolutely.
example, this is a different topic, but trauma is a taboo word. And I try to explain to people how trauma is really just those moments where all of a sudden you don't feel safe. And that interaction that you just explained,
Mhm.
between you and this individual is how I, explain to people, like, you have an experience, it imprints on you that you're not safe. And
Mhm.
that's what, for me, my interpretation of trauma is. It's the nervous system being like, and as you said, you were
Mhm.
feeling it in your body, right?
Mhm.
So I think that that's actually really important and a very like practical, tangible example of how it's even these like daily experiences of my culture is different than your culture, and I'm going to say something to you about your culture that
Yes.
can give us this imprint of like trauma, of
Mm.
I'm not safe. And
Mm.
oh, wow. So I'm going to create all these coping mechanisms around it to get through it. And, just touching on the fact that you said that everyone is unique
Mm.
in their experience of culture shock, right? As a child, as a teenager, as an adult, as whenever they're going through it. But what is your best piece of advice to give to someone to overcome it, to navigate it?
I don't know if there's just one. I don't know if there's just one. I think that it's really contextual to what's happening for you in the moment. I would say that my overarching piece of advice would be to become aware of kind of where it's sitting in your body, because what can often happen is like with trauma, right? That feeling of being unsafe or that feeling of being in danger. Um, Whenever that trauma is triggered again, the body response is actually us trying to protect ourselves. And so what can often happen is the sense of unsafety can be attached to all sorts of different things. A friend of mine gets this feeling when they speak their native language, they're bilingual, when they speak their native language outside of a setting where it's the norm. So if she's going into a shop and she gets a call from her mum and she starts talking in Welsh, she's very conscious of the English speakers around her and how they're going to be taking that. Versus if she's in a mixed setting where there's Welsh and English speakers and she's fluidly going between the two, she's not responding that way, right? So I think it's becoming aware of the context of when that feeling comes up for you, and with a professional person who can deal with that, not shame the fact that you're going into that safety mode, that you're going into that protective mode, but unraveling it and going through and getting to the core of it, right? There's a wonderful documentary by Dr. Gabor Mate, who is incredible. Absolutely love Dr. Mate. And he talks a great deal about trauma as a trigger point, really, for other things. Addiction is trying to cope with trauma. That's one of the major things he puts out there. It isn't a moral failing, but we often think of trauma and trauma response as a moral failing in society because, well, don't be a coward. Oh, well, buck up, don't cry or else I'll give you something to cry about. All of these horrific things that we say to each other and to children, right? So so I would say become aware of the context of what's happening for you and then piece the pattern together, because that will go a long way to actually then figuring out what was the initial trauma break point.
Yes, definitely. I'm agreeing with everything you say. I adore Gabor Mate. I've been
Love
following
it.
his work for a really long time because I experienced firsthand in my childhood that so my mother died when I was around 8 or 9 years old, and my
Mm,
dad immediately went to alcohol. So he was an alcoholic
mm,
a couple of years after she passed. Knowing what I know now, I'm like, oh wow, like he was experiencing extreme trauma. His entire world
yeah,
got turned upside down. And so he, sought out advice to cope with that. But even here, as I'm living in Mexico, drinking alcohol is a quite common thing, right? And as you can imagine, my relationship with alcohol, I describe it as
very
very
much so.
complex because I grew up seeing someone use it in a way that was abuse, but I've also seen people use it in a way that is fun, but also, being in Mexico, like alcohol is always at the parties. And it's something that, like, I've noticed my own trigger points around it, and it's been something that's really interesting to unpack. But obviously, as you had mentioned, um, it's important to have I would say, practitioner, a therapist, someone who really is trained in understanding that, like, you're going through a visceral body response. Like, your body is
Totally.
saying, like, we're not safe, and having that safe space to unpack it. And,
We
in
talked about
listening
that.
to you speak, I'm like, oh, wow, like, you're kind of highlighting a lot of the things that I do for my clients.
It's true, but this is the thing. I feel like a lot more people are becoming, especially professionals like ourselves. And I know your professional direction is towards therapy too. It's one of those things that we need to become more trauma informed because trauma can show up in so many different ways. We're talking about culture shock in this context, but the trauma of culture shock can be the same in many ways with the trauma of grief, with the trauma of watching, like, an accident or some kind of whatever breaks our status quo has the potential to cause trauma, and that trauma might not be recognized because, well, you've moved to a new country. In my case, that was the big thing. I blamed my parents for ages, and I'm even feeling that coming up right now. I blamed my parents for almost 25 years of my life because, I blamed them for bringing me to Canada without me having any choice. I think what made it worse was I had an older sister who was 20 at the time and had just bought a house in the UK, and she decided to stay. So suddenly I was, away from half of my family pretty much. And I blamed them. And that cognitive dissonance was palpable because they came here for good reasons. They came here for economic reasons. They came here to start a new life, to hopefully give us a better life than we could have in the UK. But I blamed them for that, and I couldn't deal with that piece, right? When I finally actually stepped into that feeling of trauma and actually worked through that and named it as, okay, I was dealing with culture shock. I was dealing with not being able to have a say in this. I was dealing with the fact that I was bullied for just being who I was. All of these things. Um, I was able to just let it go, and the weight that came off of me when I was able to let that go was amazing, right? I feel like I was just like wandering around my town for the next couple of days, just like but it's amazing how much I was holding and resenting. So I feel like that's one of the biggest pieces. We don't tend to even see it, and so then we don't even know how to deal with it, or help people who are dealing with it in our own lives, right? I think this is also part and parcel with integration. There's another really core piece around integration here. And unfortunately, what can often happen, especially in settled nations like the United States and Canada, is that the ghettoization will actually perpetuate that issue of culture shock. And so culture shock can actually happen in multiple generations. It's not just an immigrant issue. Um, and I'm thinking of Toronto, where you have all sorts of different boroughs and burbs. You have Koreatown, Chinatown, you have little Croatia, little India, all of these places, right? And so you have individuals who might grow up entirely in one cultural community, and then when they step outside that physical geographic location, move into kind of the mixed setting, they don't know how to deal with it, right? And this then becomes an issue for second, third generation kids who are born here, born wherever, and they're then having to deal with translating and having to kind of step in and out of those two worlds. It becomes normal for them. But for those individuals who are kind of in that comfortable place, it can be jarring. And so, I mean, there's a bigger discussion around that, certainly, but
There's definitely a bigger discussion around that to be had, which, we'll save it for another episode. I would
I'd
love to
love
have
it.
you
I'd
back.
love it.
But I do wanna just touch on what you were sharing around how I definitely can see that, people are seeking safety, so they stay within their community, but then the minute
Mhm.
the individual steps out of the community, then the culture shock
Yeah.
sets in, and, as someone who identifies as I don't really identify as an expat anymore, I identify more as an
Yeah.
immigrant, but my dad was born here, but just to kinda see the culture shock and just the assimilation that my father has gone through in his experience, like, I think
Mhm.
really, listening to you speak is putting a lot of things in context, so thank you for that. I do wanna ask you, just as we kind of come to a close and wrap things up, what
Mhm.
is the best way for people to get in contact with you, to learn about
Mhm.
your work, especially around, ancestral things?
Of course,
Because
yes.
I know that that was actually really the original thing that we connected on.
Yeah. Yes. Well, so I wrote a book called Ancestral Whispers, a guide to developing ancestral veneration practices. The book was really written because I saw a need, particularly amongst kind of North American settler communities, of wanting to connect with ancestors in a way that's similar to, Dia de Dia de Muertos, or other forms of ancestor work around the world that connects, and it comes back to what we talked about, that sense of belonging. I feel like on a cultural level, then there's that culture shock of so we're a community that has been over here for 200, 300 years, but our roots are in Europe, and so what do we do with that? The book's really written for anybody to connect with their ancestors, but that was really the intended goal with that. So people can find me at benstimpson.com. That's my major web portal. I have a podcast on there. I have information about my book. I have all sorts of different classes. I am a trained therapist, so I am accepting clients as well. And it's one of those things where if people are dealing with culture shock, particularly, I do tend to work with quite a few clients who find themselves in that liminal space. And we talked about this before. I feel like anybody who is in between cultures will always be in between cultures, and I think that's something that we both share. Like even I'm moving back to the UK next year. That's how great I'm dealing with my culture shock. I'm actually moving back, but I anticipate that I'm going to go back to a country that I haven't seen really for 29 years. So the culture over there is going to be different from the culture I grew up with over here, even in a British household. So I feel like becoming okay with being in the middle and really defining it for yourself. And this really comes back to that empowerment piece. Define your experience for yourself. You know, it isn't a matter of you fitting into a culture, it's that culture fitting in with you. And I think that's ultimately how I'd like to end this conversation.
I would say that's a very powerful end to the conversation. So thank you so much, Ben, for taking the time to be here and sharing your story and your experience and being so open and providing so much just like I feel like education and value and insight on just like culture shock is not just culture shock. It is so much more nuanced than that. So I will
Mhm.
make sure to link all of your information in the show notes. And until next time, this is your host, Marisol, signing off of another episode of Roaming the Now. I hope that you are enjoying wherever you are in the world. Until next time, take care. Bye.
Thanks for catching this episode of Roaming the Now. If you have not already, make sure to like and subscribe. And as always, wherever you are in the world, I hope you are enjoying Roaming the Now.